To comprehend the conflict that would ultimately consume the Tsar and his son, one must first understand the tectonic shift Peter I imposed upon his realm. The Tsardom of Muscovy at the end of the 17th century was a vast, insular, and deeply traditional estate. Its identity was rooted in the Byzantine traditions of the Orthodox Church. Its governance was a semi-minus feudal structure dominated by the ancient boyar aristocracy, and its technology and military capabilities lagged generations behind those of its Western European rivals, particularly Sweden, Poland, and the Ottoman Empire. Time itself moved to a different rhythm. The new year began on September 1st, and the calendar was dated from the purported creation of the world. It was a society that valued ritual and continuity above all else, viewing the outside world with deep suspicion. Into this world, Peter Alexeyevich Romanov arrived like a meteorological event. His formative years were marked by the brutal court politics of the Kremlin, including witnessing the bloody STRL's uprising of 1682, which instilled in him a permanent loathing for the traditionalist factions. This defining experience, however, was the Grand Embassy of 1697-1698, this 18-month tour of Western Europe was unprecedented. The Tsar of all Russia traveled to Prussia, Holland, and England. He did not go as a tourist, he went as a student and a spy. He worked with his own hands in the shipyards of the Dutch East India Company, studied artillery and fortification, observed parliamentary procedures, and absorbed the principles of mercantilism, modern administration, and secular authority. He returned to Russia not merely with new ideas, but with the conviction of a convert and the unbending will of an autocrat. The change was not gradual, it was a violent imposition. Upon his return, he personally and publicly shaved the beards of his leading boyars, an act of profound symbolic violence in a culture where a beard was seen as an image of God given to man. This was followed by a formal beard tax. He issued a series of imperial decrees, known as UKASs, that systematically dismantled the old Muscovy. He mandated Western dress for all courtiers and officials. In 1699, he reformed the calendar, aligning Russia with the Julian system used in Europe and decrying that the year 1700 would begin on January 1st. His reforms were driven by a singular, pragmatic obsession, the creation of a powerful, modern military capable of securing Russia's place among the great powers of Europe. The Great Northern War against Sweden, which began in 1700 and would last for 2 decades, became the engine of his domestic revolution. To fund and supply this war, he needed to overhaul the entire state. A modern, European-style standing army was created through conscription. A navy was built from nothing. To administer this new machine, he abolished the old Boyar Duma and replaced it with a governing Senate, an administrative body modeled on Western examples. In 1722, he would introduce the table of ranks, a formal hierarchy of military, governmental, and court posts that tied a nobleman's status to his service to the state, rather than to his birthright. This was a direct assault on the power of the old hereditary aristocracy. The very capital was moved from the ancient, sacred heart of Moscow to the new city of St. Petersburg, a port city built by forced labor on a malarial swamp at the cost of tens of thousands of lives. It was his window to the West, a physical and symbolic rejection of Russia's past. These were not merely political or economic changes, they were a cultural and spiritual revolution enforced from the top down. Every reform was an attack on a cherished tradition, and every tradition was seen by Peter as an obstacle to Russia's greatness. The Orthodox Church itself was brought under state control with the abolition of the Patriarchate and its replacement by the Holy Synod, a government department overseen by a lay official. For a significant portion of the population, from the peasant to the high-born nobleman, the Tsar was not just a modernizer, he was the Antichrist, a heretic king forcibly dragging Orthodox Russia into the godless world of the West. This profound societal schism, a kingdom at war with its own identity, created a deep reservoir of silent, resentful opposition. And it was in this simmering pool of discontent that many began to look for an alternative, a symbol of the old ways, a potential savior who could one day reverse the cataclysm. They would find him in the most dangerous place possible, the Tsar's own son and heir, the Tsarevich Alexei Petrovich, The Tsarevich Alexei Petrovich was born in 1690, a product of the very world his father would soon declare war upon. His mother was Peter's first wife, Eudoxia Lopukhaina, a woman selected from a traditional, conservative Boyar family. She was pious, steeped in the rituals of the Orthodox faith, and entirely representative of the old Muscovite court. For the first few years of Alexei's life, his world was the Terem Palace within the Kremlin, a cloistered, almost Byzantine environment of women and ancient ceremony. Peter, already consumed by his passion for shipbuilding, military drills in the German suburb, and the company of Western adventurers, was a distant and often absent figure. He viewed his wife and the traditional court she embodied with growing disdain, seeing them as symbols of the backwardness he was determined to eradicate. This parental schism defined Alexei's early development. The marriage, a political arrangement from the start, had completely broken down by the mid-1698. Upon returning from his grand embassy, Peter made the final break. He compelled Eudoxia to enter the intercession convent in Suzdal, effectively exiling her from court and from her son's life. With this act, the 8-year-old Alexei was rendered motherless. He was left in the care of Peter's half-sister, Natalia Alexei Evna. But his formative influences remained the clergy and conservative courtiers who had surrounded his mother. His primary tutor, Nikifor Zemsky, was a man of the old school who focused the young Tsarevich's education on religious texts, ecclesiastical history, and the Psalter. Alexei became fluent in Church Slavonic, the liturgical language, and developed a deep, genuine piety. He was by nature studious, introspective, and physically frail, a stark contrast to his father, a man of titanic physical stature, explosive energy, and brutally pragmatic intellect. Peter's vision for his heir was not that of a scholar-prince, but of a soldier-king in his own image. He intended for Alexei to be the inheritor and guarantor of his revolution. As Alexei entered adolescence, Peter began a campaign to forcibly remold him. He provided the boy with a new set of tutors, including a German named Martin Neugebauer, to instruct him in mathematics, geography, and foreign languages. The goal was to transform him into a modern, westernized statesman. The project was a failure. The new curriculum was grafted onto a mind already shaped by a decade of traditionalist pedagogy. Alexei showed little aptitude or interest in the technical and military subjects his father prized. He learned the languages, but did not absorb the worldview that came with them. The Tsar's reaction was one of mounting frustration, which he expressed in letters that were less paternal and more akin to a commander's reprimand to a failing subordinate. He saw his son's piety not as a virtue, but as a weakness, his intellectual pursuits as idleness, his physical delicacy as cowardice. In 1703, at the age of 13, Alexei was ordered to join the army. A year later, he was present at the successful siege of Narva. Peter's intent was to baptize his son in the fire and forge of the Great Northern War, the central project of his reign. Yet, reports sent back to the Tsar suggested that the Tsarevich performed his duties with a sullen reluctance, showing none of his father's passion for military affairs. He was present but not engaged. Throughout this period, a dangerous dynamic solidified. Peter applied pressure, issuing commands and expecting immediate, enthusiastic compliance. Alexei responded with passive resistance. He would obey but slowly, inefficiently, and often with pleas of ill health. He created a life for himself separate from his father's court, a circle of friends and confessors who shared his quiet disapproval of the new order. His spiritual father, the Archpriest Yakov Ignat Yev, became a central figure in his life, reinforcing his traditionalist values. This was not yet a political conspiracy, but a shadow court was beginning to form in the minds of those who felt disenfranchised by the Petrine reforms. They saw in the quiet, pious Tsarevich a vessel for their hopes of a future restoration of the old ways. Peter, a man acutely sensitive to any threat to his authority, began to perceive his son not merely as a disappointment, but as a potential focal point for sedition. Intended to be the ultimate instrument of the Tsar's will, was instead becoming the living symbol of everything he sought to destroy. The marriage was a failure from its inception, becoming a microcosm of the larger conflict. Princess Charlotte was intelligent, cultured, and accustomed to the sophisticated life of a German court. She found her husband to be sullen, withdrawn, and often intoxicated. Alexei made little effort to conceal his disdain for the arrangement. He spent his time not with his new wife, but with his old circle of Russian attendants and priests, creating a small, defiant island of Muscovite tradition within a German court. He communicated with Charlotte in German, a language he knew but disliked, and their interactions were formal and cold. He neglected her, and his heavy drinking, a problem that would plague his adult life, became more pronounced. The union, intended to westernize Alexei, instead caused him to retreat deeper into the familiar comforts of his Russian identity. Despite the personal animosity, the marriage fulfilled its primary dynastic function. In 1714, Charlotte gave birth to a daughter, Natalia, and in October 1715, she produced the all-minus important male heir Peter Alexeyevich. The birth of a grandson should have secured the line of succession and pleased the Tsar. Instead, it presented him with a new dilemma. The future of his empire was now embodied in an infant whose father he fundamentally distrusted and whose upbringing he could not directly control. The child was being raised in a household that, even when residing in St. Petersburg, remained a center of quiet opposition to his reforms. The situation reached a critical inflection point just days after the birth of the new heir. On October 22, 1715, Princess Charlotte died from complications of childbirth. Her death severed the direct political link to the Holy Roman Emperor and, in a practical sense, freed Alexei from the daily burden of a marriage he had never wanted. The event starkly illuminated the gulf between father and son. Peter's reaction was primarily one of political and diplomatic calculation, was secondary to the new strategic reality. He was now a widower with a male heir, a position of both vulnerability and potential power. This development coincided with a momentous event in Peter's own domestic life. The Tsar had long been in a relationship with a woman named Martis Kaurenskar, a Lithuanian peasant of obscure origin captured during the Great Northern War. He had renamed her Catherine Alexeyevna, converted her to Orthodoxy, and formally married her in 1712. She was everything his first wife, Eudoxia, was not. Robust, pragmatics of his military campaigns. She was the perfect consort for his new Russia. Critically, she had also borne him children. Just 1 week after Charlotte's death, in November 1715, Catherine gave birth to a healthy son, also named Peter Petrovich. The existence of this second family fundamentally altered the dynastic calculus. The Tsar now had two male heirs. The first, Alexei, was the product of his past, the son of a traditional boyar wife, steeped in the old religion, and the reluctant symbol of a resentful aristocracy. The second, Peter Petrovich, was the product of his present and future, the son of a self-made consort, born into the new capital of St. The ideological conflict was no longer an abstract disagreement about policy and culture. It now had a clear, dynastic dimension. The succession was no longer a settled fact, but a choice. This choice was presented to Alexei in a letter from his father dated October 11, 1715, written on the very day of his grandson's birth and before the death of Princess Charlotte. The timing was deliberate and brutal. Peter did not offer congratulations. Instead, he delivered a scathing indictment of Alexei's character and performance, accusing him of indolence, disobedience, and a lack of interest in state affairs. He condemned his son's association with bearded men who wished for a return to the old ways. The letter was an ultimatum, stating that a son who refused to serve the state as he did was no son at all. The conflict between the two realized into an explicit threat. Alexei was now faced with a choice that was no choice at all, to completely undoubtedly transform himself into a clone of his father, or to be cut out of the line of succession entirely. The ultimatum delivered in October 1715 was the culmination of years of escalating disappointment. From Peter's perspective, he had provided his son with every opportunity to prove himself a worthy successor, and Alexei had failed at every turn. These were not the failures of a rebellious youth engaging in courtly intrigue or personal vice. They were failures of a far more fundamental nature. They were failures of aptitude and, most damningly of will. The Tsar saw his son's character as a direct threat to the survival of the new Russia he was constructing at such an enormous cost in blood and treasure. The Great Northern War, now in its 15th year, was the forge in which Peter's state was being hammered into shape, and he expected his heir to be a master blacksmith. Instead, he saw a man who seemed to flee the heat and the noise of the forge. Alexei's military record was a primary source of his father's contempt. While he had been present at the siege of Nov and accompanied the army on campaigns, his contributions were consistently judged to be passive and uninspired. Peter, who lived and breathed military strategy, who personally designed ships and cannons, and who was never happier than when in the field with his troops, could not comprehend his son's lack of enthusiasm. Letters from commanders and observers, likely curated to confirm the Tsar's own biases, depicted the Tsarevich as listless, more concerned with religious observance than with siege minus craft or logistics. During the pivotal Podlava campaign in 1709, a moment of existential crisis for Russia, Alexei was not on the battlefield, but was tasked with overseeing the defense and fortification of Moscow. It was a vital role, but in Peter's mind it was a secondary one. Far from the crucible of decision-making, the son was managing the old capital while the father was birthing a new empire on the battlefield. Administrative duties, which Peter saw as the essential machinery of a modern state, proved to be another area of perceived failure. Tasks that the Tsar would have attacked with ferocious energy, Alexei performed with a prodding sense of obligation. When charged with procuring supplies and conscripts, his efforts were deemed slow and inefficient. Peter's correspondence is filled with impatient instructions and rebukes, micromanaging his son from afar, complex mechanism that required constant, forceful intervention to function. He saw in Alexei a complete absence of this driving, coercive energy. The son's preference for study and contemplation was, in the father's eyes, not a different style of leadership but a complete dereliction of duty. The mission to Dresden for his education and marriage arrangements was also cast as a failure. While the marriage to Princess Charlotte was eventually concluded, reports reached Peter that Alexei had spent much of his time abroad in the company of his traditionalist Russian retainers, drinking heavily and making little effort to absorb the political or cultural lessons of the German courts. He had been sent to the West to be transformed by it, but he had merely resided there, insulated within his own Muscovite bubble. The Tsar had hoped to see his son return with new skills in engineering, statecraft, and diplomacy. Instead, he returned with a foreign wife whom he resented and an even more deeply entrenched aversion to the world she represented. These specific failures were symptoms of what Peter identified as the core problem, Alexei's character. In his letter of October 1715, Peter uses language that is astonishingly direct and cruel. He calls Alexei a useless member of the body politic, comparing him to a gangrenous limb that must be amputated lest it infect the whole. He writes, "How many times have I scolded you for this, and not just scolded but beaten you? And all for nothing, all is in vain, all is to no purpose. You do not want to do anything, you only want to live at home in ease and do nothing good." The mention of physical beatings is not metaphorical. It was a common disciplinary to love the era, and Peter was known for his violent temper. The birth of his grandson did not assuage the Tsar's fears, it amplified them. He foresaw a future where the throne would pass to this infant, but the regency would fall to Alexei. In that scenario, all of his life's work would be undone. Peter imagined a court dominated by Alexei's bearded friends, the priests and reactionary boyars, who would immediately set about dismantling his reforms. The navy would be left to rot, the new secular schools would be closed, the army would revert to the old state-sanctioned model, and the capital would be moved back to Moscow. St. Petersburg, his magnificent and costly paradise, would sink back into the swamp. This was not just a fear of policy change, it was a vision of existential annihilation for the Russia he had created. His son's perceived incompetence was therefore not a personal failing, it was a national security threat of the highest order. The burden of this expectation was absolute. Alexei had not just failed to carry it, he had refused to even lift it. The Tsar's condemnation did not exist in a vacuum. Every reform Peter enacted created a class of victims, and every tradition he abolished left behind a residue of resentment. As Peter's letters grew colder and his demands more absolute, the figure of the Tsarevich Alexei became a powerful magnet for these disparate streams of discontent. He was the living antithesis of his father's project. Where Peter was revolutionary, Alexei was revolutionary. Alexei was conservative. Alexei was pious and traditional. He did not need to plot or conspire. His very existence offered a silent, potent alternative to the Petrine state. He became less a person and more a principle, a focal point for a silent, resentful coalition of the disenfranchised who saw in him the hope for a future restoration. The most powerful and organized of these factions was the clergy. Peter's ecclesiastical regulation of 1721 was still in the future, but its foundational principles were already being implemented. The abolition of the Patriarchate of Moscow in 1700 and its eventual replacement with the state-controlled Holy Synod was the single most radical attack on the traditional structure of Russian society. It subordinated the spiritual authority of the Church to the temporal power of the Tsar. The Tsar and the Patriarch had ruled in a state of symphony, a theoretical harmony of co-equal powers. Peter shattered this symphony, making the Church just another department of his government. Many bishops, priests, and monks viewed this with horror. They saw Peter as a heretic, if not the Antichrist prophesied in Scripture, who was allowing Protestant and Catholic influences to pollute the purity of the Orthodox faith. Who spent hours in prayer and revered the clergy, they saw a potential savior. Figures like his personal confessor, Yakov Ignat Yev, were not just spiritual guides, they became political confidants, reinforcing Alexei's belief that his father's path was a blasphemous deviation from Russia's sacred destiny. A second and equally alienated group was the old boyar aristocracy. These were the ancient families whose power and status were based on heredity and land ownership. Peter's reforms were a direct assault on their entire way of life. The table of ranks, introduced formally later but already in effect in principle, replaced birthright with merit and state service as the determinant of status. A man of humble origins could now rise above a prince of the Rurikid dynasty through military or administrative achievement. The Tsar's new court was filled with foreigners and low-born Russian fledglings whom he favored for their skills, not their lineage. These old families, forced to shave their beards, wear uncomfortable Western clothes, and send their sons to technical schools, looked upon the new order with contempt. In Moscow, the old capital, they still considered the true heart of Russia. They gathered and spoke of a time when the Tsar would die and his unnatural son, the Tsarevich Alexei, would restore their rightful place at the pinnacle of society. Alexander Kikin, a man who had once been close to Peter but had fallen from favor, became a key figure in Alexei's circle, articulating the grievances of this displaced elite. Beyond the elite, the Tsar's reforms exacted a terrible price from the common populace. The construction of Petersburg, the digging of canals, and the manning of the new factories and mines were accomplished through forced, unpaid peasant labor. The death toll was staggering. The new standing army was filled through a brutal system of lifelong conscription that tore young men from their villages, never to return. The taxes required to fund the endless Great Northern War rushing. For many ordinary Russians, Peter's reign was an apocalypse of work, war and taxation. Among these people, and particularly among the schismatic old believers who had long seen the state as corrupt, whispers and prophecies circulated. They spoke of the Germans who occupied the throne and longed for a true Russians to deliver them. The pious Alexei, grandson of the deeply loved Tsar Alexis the Most Quiet, was the natural candidate for this role in the popular imagination. This growing opposition was, for the most part, passive. It was a conspiracy of shared sentiment rather than coordinated action. The conversations in Alexei's circle were nor assassination but of waiting. Their plan was simply to outlive the Tsar. They would ask the Tsarevich what he would do upon his accession. Would he abandon the fleet? "It is not a C-faring people we are," he might reply, suggesting the ships would be left to rot. Would he move the capital back to Moscow? He would speak fondly of the old city and its sacred churches. Would he allow the nobles to live on their estates rather than serve the state? He would sympathize with their burdens. Alexei did not lead this faction, he merely validated it with his presence and his sympathetic ear. He became a repository for their hopes and a mirror for their resentments. But in the absolute monarchy that Peter was building, a state held together by the force of a single will, such thoughts were not merely dissent. They were treason. And Peter, with his pervasive network of informers and his deep seated paranoia, was beginning to hear the whispers. The Tsar's fury, once ignited, was not an ephemeral passion but a cold, grinding instrument of state policy. His growing conviction that his son was the nexus of a vast, silent conspiracy against his life's work transformed their personal correspondence into a one-sided legal inquisition. The letters Peter sent to Alexei 1715 and 1715 and 1716 were no longer the reprimands of a disappointed father. They were the meticulously crafted indictments of a prosecutor minus king. Each word was a stone in the wall that was being built around the Tsarevich, a wall from which there would be only two possible exits. The pen was not mightier than the sword. In Peter's hands, it became the sword, a weapon of psychological warfare designed to break his son's spirit and force him into a final, irrevocable choice. The letter of October 11, 1715 had set the brutal terms. It was a declaration of Alexei's unworthiness, a catalogue of his failures, and the clearest reply was a masterclass in the passive resistance he had perfected over the years. Pleading physical weakness and a lack of the necessary intellectual faculties, he wrote back not to his father and sovereign, but directly to the point. I see myself to be unfit and little minus suited for a task of such importance. He wrote, on account of the illnesses from which I suffer, and which are increasing, and which render me weak and incapable of governing so many people. He declared his intention to enter the monastic life, and serve God there in quiet and without cares. By offering to become a monk, he was attempting to remove himself from the political chessboard entirely. A man who took monastic vows was considered legally unpolitically dead. It was, in his mind, the perfect, pious solution, a way to satisfy his father's demand, to be rid of him while preserving his own life and spiritual integrity. Peter saw this response not as a solution, but as a cunning evasion. He knew that a monastic tonsure was not an irreversible act. History was filled with examples of monks who had been called back to the throne by popular demand or political intrigue. A living, breathing Alexei, even in a monastery, would remain a potent symbol for the opposition. As long as he was alive and in Russia, he would be a threat. As long as he was alive and in Russia, he would be a threat. The Tsar's reply, written in January 1716, was sharp and suspicious. He dismissed Alexei's claims of ill health as a lie. He then laid out the central flaw in Alexei's proposal. Monks are not bound by an oath to be faithful to anyone. And so now, under the pretense of this monkhood, the evil ones, the bearded ones, will be able to approach you, and what they can think up, you yourself know. Peter saw the monastery not as a retreat from the world, but as a potential headquarters for the counter-revolution. He then sharpened the ultimatum. Renunciation alone was not enough. The choice was not simply between the crown and the cloister. He presented Alexei with two clear, non-negotiable paths. The first was to change your ways, and without hypocrisy make yourself worthy of the succession. This meant a complete and total transformation of his character, a public embrace of his father's policies, and a zealous dedication to military and state affairs. But Peter added a chilling condition: if you do not, then know that I will deprive you of the succession completely, and I will cut you off like a gangrenous growth. He gave his son no time for reflection, demanding an immediate decision. Do not think to outsmart me, the letter concluded. If you thought to deceive me in your letter, it will not work. This relentless psychological pressure was amplified by Peter's actions. He was now openly favoring his infant son by Catherine, Peter Petrovich. The court was made to understand that the Tsar was grooming a new heir, a blank slate upon whom he could impress his vision for the future. Alexei was being systematically isolated. His friends and confidants were monitored. He was living in a state of constant anxiety, trapped between his father's impossible demands and his own deeply held convictions. He could not become the man his father wanted him to be. The very idea was a violation of his soul. Yet the alternative, the monastery, was now being presented not as a safe harbor but as a trap, one that his father clearly believed was a dishonest ploy. Faced with this unbearable dilemma, Alexei's passive resistance began to crumble. He sent another letter, a desperate, fawning plea, reaffirming his desire to become a monk and swearing an oath on the Gospels to renounce the throne himself, but for his son, the infant Peter Alexeyevich. He was trying to give his father everything he thought he wanted, short of his own self-minus annihilation, but the Tsar's silence in response was more terrifying than his anger. He left his son in St. Petersburg, stewing in a state of uncertainty and fear, while he himself prepared to depart for another extended trip to Western Europe. The Tsar's pen had done its work. It had dismantled every defense, rejected every compromise, and left Alexei with the terrifying realization that there was no safe place for him in Russia. He had been given a choice, but he now understood that both options could very well lead to his destruction. The Tsar's final ultimatum, delivered before his departure for Europe in early 1716, hung in the air like a headsman's axe. Alexei was given a stark, binary choice: completely transform his nature and become a zealous disciple of the Petrine Revolution, or take monastic vows and disappear from the world. For Alexei, this was a choice between two forms of death. The first was a spiritual and psychological death, a forced conversion that would require him to betray every belief he held sacred. The second was a political and civil death, a withdrawal into the cloister that his father had already branded as a potential hotbed of sedition. The Tsar's letters had made it clear that he viewed the monastic option with deep suspicion, believing it to be a strategic retreat rather than a sincere act of renunciation. This left Alexei in an impossible position. Any path he chose within Russia was fraught with peril and subject to his father's violent disapproval. The choice between the cloister and the crown was not a new dilemma in Russian history, but the context under Peter the Great gave it a unique and deadly weight. Historically, the monastery had served as a kind of gilded prison for inconvenient members of the royal family. Peter's own half-minor sister, Sophia, had been confined to the Novodevichy convent after her failed bid for power. His first wife, Eudoxia, was similarly cloistered. For these women, it was the end of their political life. But for a male heir, the situation was different. The very act of taking monastic vows, the post-rig, was a profound ritual. It involved a symbolic shearing of hair, the receiving of a new name, and the donning of monastic robes. It was a public declaration of one's departure from the secular world. Alexei, in his letters, clung to this option because it was the only one that seemed to offer a legitimate, culturally understood exit from his responsibilities, sanctioned by centuries of orthodox tradition. However, Peter was a man who respected tradition only when it served his purposes. He saw the institution of monasticism itself with a reformer's skeptical eye. He viewed the thousands of monks in Russia's monasteries not as men of prayer, but as idle hands, a drain on the state's productive capacity. His later reforms would severely restrict the number of new monks and put monastery lands and finances under state control. Therefore, when Alexei proposed this path, Peter did not see a pious son seeking salvation. He saw a cunning adversary attempting to use the archaic rules of the old system to outmaneuver him. He envisioned a future where, upon his death, a cabal of reactionary priests and boyars would declare Alexei's monastic vows to have been taken under duress, absolve him of his oaths, and place him on the throne as the restorer of the old faith. This suspicion rendered the monastic option a trap. If Alexei were to enter a monastery, he would be under constant surveillance. Any contact with his old associates would be interpreted as conspiracy. He would be isolated, powerless, yet still a potential symbol. His life would depend entirely on his father's continued whim. He could be left to languish, or he could be disposed of at any convenient moment, far from the public eye. The cloister, which should have been a sanctuary, had become a prison cell with a perpetually unlocked door behind which stood his father, the jailer. The other option, the crown, was equally untenable. It required a complete and utter capitulation. Alexei would have to publicly renounce his friends and confessors. He would need to display a sudden and convincing passion for shipbuilding, artillery, and the intricacies of European diplomacy. He would have to embrace the Western customs he loathed, oversee the policies that he believed were destroying Russia's soul, and become the chief enforcer of his father's will. It was a demand for a complete psychological reconstruction. Given his nature and his deeply ingrained beliefs, this was not just difficult, it was impossible. Any attempt to feign this conversion would be transparent to his hyper-minus perceptive and paranoid father. A single misstep, a moment of insincere enthusiasm, would be seen as proof of the hypocrisy Peter had warned him against, confirming that he was merely biding his time. This path was a lie he could not hope to sustain, and the penalty for being discovered in that lie would be severe. The Tsar's departure for Europe in early 1716, leaving the ultimatum unanswered and festering, was a calculated act of psychological cruelty. He had presented his son with an impossible choice and then withdrawn, leaving him to suffocate in the vacuum of indecision. Alexei was ordered to think on the matter and, if he chose the path of succession, to join his father abroad to begin his new life as a dutiful apprentice. If he chose the monastery, he was to act immediately. He remained in streets, Petersburg, paralyzed by fear and uncertainty. He began to complain of illness, his old tactic of passive resistance. He claimed to be spitting blood, a symptom perhaps of genuine psychosomatic distress or a desperate attempt to buy more time. But time was the one thing he no longer had. The choice had been framed, the terms were absolute, and inaction itself was becoming a decision his father would interpret as defiance. And the two sanctioned exits were both blocked by mortal danger. The feigned illness that had served as Alexei's shield throughout the summer and early autumn of 1716 began to wear thin. From his new base of operations in Copenhagen, where he was overseeing the final stages of the Great Northern War, Tsar Peter grew increasant. His letters once again began to arrive, each one shorter and sharper than the last. He dismissed his son's complaints of spitting blood and physical frailty as pathetic excuses. The time for deliberation was over. Peter issued a direct, unambiguous command. Alexei was to leave St. Petersburg at once and join him in Copenhagen to serve with the army. If his health was truly too poor for military duties, he was to come anyway. Failure to appear would be interpreted as a final act of disobedience, with consequences that the Tsar left unstated but were terrifyingly clear. This command shattered Alexei's paralysis. The abstract threat had now become a concrete journey with a fixed destination and a terrifying endpoint. The path of inaction was no longer available. He could no longer delay or prevaricate. He was being summoned into the direct physical presence of the man he feared more than anyone on earth. This summons catalyzed a circle of confidants around him, transforming their passive sympathy into active, urgent counsel. They understood that sending Alexei to his father was tantamount to delivering a lamb to the slaughter. The chief architect of the new strategy was Alexander Kikin, a man of considerable intelligence and ambition. Kikin had a unique perspective on the Tsar's temperament. He had once been one of Peter's favorites, a skilled shipbuilder who had risen high in the new meritocracy. However, a falling out and accusations of corruption had seen him disgraced and exiled for a time. He had been allowed to return to court, but never regained his former influence. He harbored a deep resentment and, more importantly, a clear minor-side, unsentimental understanding of Peter's capacity for absolute ruthlessness. He saw the Tsar's ultimatum not as a choice, but as a meticulously constructed trap. In a series of secret meetings, Kikin and others in Alexei's circle deconstructed the situation. To go to Copenhagen, Kikin argued, was suicide. Peter would either break Alexei completely, forcing him into a public recantation of his old life and turning him into a puppet, or he would find some pretext to imprison him indefinitely. The Tsar's letters had already laid the legal groundwork for declaring him a traitor. The monastery, Kikin insisted, was an even more foolish option. It was a self-imposed prison where Alexei would be isolated from his others and could be quietly eliminated without witness or protest. Both of Peter's choices led to the same outcome, the complete neutralization of the Tsarevich. From this bleak analysis, a third option emerged, born of desperation. If there was no safety to be found within Russia's borders, then safety must be sought outside them. The plan was audacious, unprecedented, and an act of clear treason. The heir to the Russian throne would flee and seek political asylum from a foreign power. It was Kikin who likely proposed the specific destination, Vienna, the court of the Holy Roman Emperor, Charles VI. The choice was not arbitrary. It was a calculated political move. Charles VI was the brother of Alexei's deceased wife, Princess Charlotte. This familial connection, however tenuous, provided a plausible pretext for the appeal. Alexei could present himself not as a traitor seeking to overthrow his father, but as a persecuted son seeking the temporary protection of his kinsman. He could claim he was fleeing his father's wrath and the influence of certain powerful figures at court, most notably the Tsar's low-born favorite Alexander Menshikov. The plan was as simple in concept as it was perilous in execution. Alexei would pretend to obey his father's summons. He would make all the necessary preparations for a journey to Copenhagen. He would be given state funds, an official retinue, and the freedom of movement necessary to leave Russia. But at a predetermined point, likely near Riga or in Poland, he would alter his course, heading south towards Silesia and the Habsburg lands. Secrecy was absolute. Only a tiny inner circle was aware of the true destination. Accompanying Alexei would be his Finnish mistress, Afrosinya Fedorova, a serf girl who had become his constant companion and was pregnant with his child. Her presence underscores the personal, rather than purely political, nature of his flight. He was not just escaping a political fate, but seeking to build a new life, however precarious, away from his father's suffocating control. For Alexei, a man defined by passivity and indecision, this was a terrifying leap into the unknown. He was not a natural conspirator. The evidence suggests he was pushed into this course of action by Kikin and others, who convinced him that the certain danger of obeying his father outweighed the uncertain risks of flight. He was a cornered animal, choosing to leap from a cliff rather than be taken by the hunter. In late September of 1716, Tsarevich Alexei Petrovich, heir to the Russian Empire, informed the authorities in St. Petersburg that he was finally complying with the Tsar's command. He set out on the road to Copenhagen, knowing he would never arrive. The journey that began in St. Petersburg on September 26, 1716, was a masterpiece of deception, meticulously planned to disarm suspicion at every stage. To all outward appearances, the Tsarevich hoped to join his father in Copenhagen. He traveled with a small, carefully selected retinue, official travel documents, and a state-allocated budget. The pace was unhurried, consistent with a man still claiming to be in fragile health. Met with local governors, then sent regular, placating dispatches back to Russia, creating a documentary trail that pointed directly towards Denmark. The entire operation was a calculated fiction, a performance for an audience of one, the Tsar and his network of informants. Alexei's route initially took him westward, through northern and into Russian-controlled Livonia. The critical moment, the point of no return, occurred near Riga. Here the road forked. The northern route led towards the port of Danzig, the logical path for a journey to Copenhagen. The southern route led into Courland and then into the vast Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, a territory of weak central authority, unshifting allegiances, and the gateway to the Habsburg land. Under the pretext of a change in travel plans, Alexei ordered his convoy south. Most of his retinue were unaware of the true objective until the last possible moment, minimizing the risk of betrayal. The journey across Poland and into Silesia was fraught with tension. Alexei was now a fugitive, traveling incognito. He adopted aliases, shedding the public identity of the Tsarevich for the anonymity of a minor official or merchant. He was in a constant state of fear, seeing potential spies in every inn and at every border crossing. His small party was vulnerable, and the success of their mission depended on moving fast and the news of their defection. Eventually, the Russian ambassador in Copenhagen would report that the Tsarevich had not arrived. The Tsar's diplomatic and intelligence apparatus would be activated, and a manhunt of continental scale would begin. On or around November 10, 1716, Alexei and his small group, including his pregnant mistress Afrosinya, finally crossed the border into Habsburg territory. They made their way to Vienna, the imperial capital. The arrival of the heir to the Russian throne, unannounced and seeking protection, sent a shockwave through the court of Emperor Charles VI. This was not a minor diplomatic incident. It was a political crisis of the first order. The emperor was now the unwilling host of the most high-profile defector in Europe. Alexei was granted an immediate, secret audience with the emperor's vice-chancellor, Count Schönborn. The account he gave was a carefully curated narrative of victimhood. He portrayed his father as a tyrannical and dangerously unstable ruler, surrounded by corrupt advisors like Alexander Menshikov. He claimed that he had been unjustly persecuted, that his life was in danger, and that he had been threatened with forced unsure or even death. The emperor's sister Law begging for protection in her name. He was careful not to position himself as a rival claimant to the throne or to seek military aid for a rebellion. His request was for personal sanctuary, for a safe place to hide until his father's death, at which point he claimed he would peacefully assume his rightful inheritance. The Emperor Charles I was placed in an extraordinarily delicate position. On one hand, the law of nations and the bonds of family, however tenuous, obligated him to offer protection to a royal figure seeking asylum from clear and present danger. Harboring Alexei also gave him a significant, if dangerous, political bargaining chip in his dealings with the increasingly powerful Russian Tsar. On the other hand, granting this protection was a direct and provocative insult to Peter the Great. It was an act of interference in the internal affairs of the Russian monarchy and could potentially lead to a full-blown diplomatic rupture or even war. Russia and Austria were not enemies at this time. They were tentative partners in the complex web of European alliances, particularly concerning the Ottoman Empire. The emperor's solution was one of cautious containment. He agreed to grant Alexei protection but insisted on absolute secrecy. The Tsarevich could not remain in Vienna, where his presence would be impossible to conceal for long. Instead, he and his mistress were quietly moved, under guard, to the remote fortress of Arenberg in the Tyrol. They were given new identities. Alexei was now known as a heir. He was in effect a state secret, a prisoner of the very man who was protecting him. He had successfully escaped his father's immediate reach, trading a Russian cage for an Austrian one. But he had also internationalized a domestic dispute, transforming a family tragedy into a European political drama. The clandestine journey was over, but the hunt was just beginning. The fortress of Arenberg, perched high in the Tyrolean Alps, was a formidable stone structure designed to withstand a siege. Not to house a royal refugee, it was a place of strategic importance, commanding a key pass, and its comforts were those of a military garrison. For the Tsarevich Alexei, this was the physical reality of the sanctuary he had been granted. He was safe from his father's immediate grasp, but he was also a prisoner. His movements were restricted to the fortress and its immediate surroundings. His correspondence was monitored. His only consistent companion was his mistress Afra's Ignore. He had exchanged the vast, gilded cage of the Russian court for a smaller, colder, and far more isolated one. His future was now entirely contingent on the political will of his host, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles I. The emperor's decision to shelter the Tsarevich was a complex calculus of risk and opportunity, debated in the secret councils of the Hofburg Palace in Vienna. The principle of monarchical solidarity contended with the pragmatic realities of realpolitik. On one hand, there was a moral and dynastic obligation to refuse a fellow royal, a kinsman by marriage, who claimed his life was in danger would be a stain on the emperor's honor. The possession of the Russian heir was a political asset of immense potential value. The Tsarevich could be used as leverage in future negotiations with Russia, a constant, implicit threat that could be deployed to moderate Peter's ambitions in Poland, the Balkans, or the Holy Roman Empire itself. On the other hand, the risks were enormous. Peter the Great was not a conventional European monarch. He was viewed in Vienna as a semi-barbaric force of nature, a ruler of unpredictable temper and immense, autocratic power. To be discovered harboring his fugitive son was to invite a diplomatic crisis of unparalleled severity. It could shatter the fragile Ottoman coalition in Eastern Europe and potentially drag the Habsburg Empire into a conflict it could not afford, especially with its ongoing rivalries with France and Spain. The Tsar was not a man to be trifled with, and his reaction to such a profound personal and political insult was likely to be violent and disproportionate. Consequently, the Austrian policy was one of absolute secrecy and plausible deniability. Vice-Chancellor Schomburn, the primary architect of the strategy, instructed all officials involved to operate under the strictest confidentiality. Alexei's presence was a state secret known only to the emperor and a handful of his ministers. When the first tentative inquiry from Russian diplomats in Vienna and other European capitals, the official Austrian response was a blank wall of ignorance. They knew nothing, they had seen nothing. The Tsarevich had not crossed their borders. It was a dangerous diplomatic game, a high-stakes bluff that depended on the efficiency of their own security and the presumed inefficiency of Russian intelligence. For several weeks, the secret held. In Russia, the official narrative was that the Tsarevich was still en route to join his father. The delay was attributed to his poor health and the difficulties of winter travel. Peter himself, occupied with military planning in Denmark and Holland, initially seems to have accepted this. But as the weeks turned into months, and Alexei failed to materialize, Peter's suspicion hardened into certainty. The Tsar, a master of espionage and covert operations, did not believe his son had simply vanished. He knew he had fled, and he was determined to find him. The initial relief Alexei may have felt in Arenberg slowly curdled into a state of profound anxiety. He was cut off from the world with no news from his supporters in Russia and only the carefully filtered information his Austrian keepers chose to provide. His mistress, Afrosinya, gave birth to a son in the fortress, an event that only highlighted their vulnerability. He was now a father with an illegitimate child, entirely dependent on the charity of a foreign power. He had achieved physical safety, but he had lost all agency. The Tsarevich was transformed from a person into a political instrument, a chess piece held in reserve by the emperor, its value determined entirely by its potential use against his father. He could be protected, but he could also be bargained away if the political price was right. The sanctuary was conditional, its terms subject to change without notice, and all the while, the silence from Russia was not the silence of forgetting, but the quiet, methodical process of a continent-wide search being set in motion. The fiction of the Tsarevich delayed journey could not be sustained indefinitely. By the winter of 1717, what had been a source of private anxiety for Tsar Peter had metastasized into a public embarrassment and a grave matter of state security. The heir to the throne had vanished. This was not merely a family disgrace, it was a profound political vulnerability. It suggested instability at the very heart of the Russian autocracy and provided potential ammunition to both domestic enemies and foreign rivals. The Tsar's response was accordingly swift, systematic, and utterly devoid of sentiment. The search for Alexei Petrovich was entrusted to the full might of his diplomatic and intelligence apparatus. The initial phase of the investigation was a broad sweep. Russian ambassadors and residents in every major European capital from Paris to Berlin, The Hague to Warsaw, were instructed to make discreet and then increasingly insistent inquiries. They were to monitor the movements of any known associates of the Tsarevich, tap their networks of local informants, and report any rumor, no matter how faint. This was not a passive gathering of information. Peter authorized the use of significant funds to buy intelligence. The search was a state priority, superseding all other diplomatic concerns. The focus of this vast intelligence operation soon narrowed to the Habsburg domains. The family connection through Alexei's late wife was too obvious to ignore. The Russian resident in Vienna, Avram Veselovsky, was a capable and tenacious diplomat. He began a relentless campaign of pressure on the court of Emperor Charles VI. He requested formal audiences, submitted official notes, and sought private meetings with ministers, all with the same question: what information did the imperial court have regarding the whereabouts of the Tsarevich? The response he received was a masterfully executed performance of polite incomprehension. Vice-Chancellor Schomburn and his subordinates expressed their deepest concern for the Tsar's distress, promised to conduct their own inquiries, and offered their full cooperation. But they maintained, with unwavering consistency, that the Tsarevich had not entered Habsburg land. This diplomatic stonewalling, however, could not conceal the truth from Peter's other sources. The Tsar's intelligence network was not limited to his embassies. He had a vast web of informal agents, spies, and paid informants scattered across the continent, a legacy of the long years of the Great Northern War. A breakthrough likely came from a lower-level source, a postmaster who noted suspicious travel arrangements, a merchant who recognized a face, or a disgruntled official in the Austrian administration willing to sell a secret. By the spring of 1717, Peter had received credible intelligence placing his son definitively within the emperor's territory. The secret was out. For the Austrians, this was a disastrous development. Their bluff had been called. To continue denying Alexei's presence in the face of credible evidence would be to brand themselves as liars, an untenable position that would destroy their diplomatic credibility and could provoke the Tsar into open hostility. Recognizing the extreme danger of the situation, they made a critical decision. Alexei had to be moved. Relatively close to the German states and more accessible to Russian agents, was no longer secure. A new, more remote location was needed. In May 1717, Austrian officials arrived at Ehrenberg and informed Alexei that he was being relocated for his own safety. He was given no choice in the matter. Once again, he was moved under cover of darkness, a piece of high-value political cargo being transported across the continent. His new destination was the Castel Sant'Elmo, a massive, star-shaped fortress looming over the city of Naples. At the time, the Kingdom of Naples was a possession of the Habsburg Crown, administered by an Austrian viceroy. It was geographically and psychologically as far from Russia as one could get, while remaining within the emperor's direct control. The logic was sound. It would be far more difficult and expensive for Peter's agents to operate effectively in southern Italy. The move, however, was a strategic error. While it increased the physical distance, it also confirmed Russian suspicions. The large-scale, clandestine movement of a high-profile individual is difficult to hide completely. The trail, though faint, leads south. Tsarevich in Vienna, now armed with more concrete information, was able to escalate his pressure from inquiry to accusation. He could now confront the Austrian government, not with rumors, but with evidence. The polite fiction of mutual concern was burned away, revealing the stark reality of a major international confrontation. Russia, a rising and formidable military power, was now accusing the Holy Roman Empire, the ancient heart of Christian Europe, of actively harboring a fugitive and traitor. The question was no longer where the Tsarevich was, but what the Tsar was prepared to do to get him back. The confirmation of his son's location, likely reaching Peter the Great in Amsterdam in the spring of 1717, did not provoke a theatrical outburst but rather a chilling coalescence of personal fury and state policy. For the Tsar, the distinction between the two had long since dissolved. An insult to the father was an act of treason against the state. A betrayal by the son was a fundamental threat to the empire's security. The news that the Emperor Charles V had not only sheltered the fugitive, but had actively concealed him and moved him to Naples, was the ultimate perfidy. It was a direct challenge to his authority, a public declaration by a rival monarch that Russia's internal affairs were subject to foreign intervention. The fury was personal and immense, but the resolve it produced was cold, strategic, and absolute. Peter's response was a two-pronged assault, one overt and diplomatic, the other covert and psychological. The diplomatic front was escalated immediately. He commanded his resident in Vienna, Tsarevich, to drop all pretense of polite inquiry. Tsarevich was to confront the imperial court with the incontrovertible proof of their deception and to issue what amounted to an ultimatum. He was to demand the immediate surrender of the deserter, framing it not as a fundamental principle of international law between sovereign states. The threats were explicit. Peter warned of a complete rupture in diplomatic relations. He hinted at the suspension of Russian cooperation against the Ottoman Empire, a matter of vital strategic importance to Vienna. Behind these diplomatic threats lay the unspoken but universally understood possibility of war. The Tsar was signaling that he was prepared to destabilize the entire political order of Eastern Europe to retrieve his son. He was turning his personal obsession into a continental crisis. This extreme reaction was fueled by the profound political damage Alexei's defection had caused. It was a public referendum on his entire reign, conducted on the European stage. The flight of his own heir gave credence to every criticism leveled against him by his domestic and foreign enemies. It validated the narrative of the resentful boyars that he was an unnatural tyrant. It armed the conservative clergy with proof of his impiety. It was a sign of deep instability within the Romanov dynasty, a weakness to be exploited. Alexei, sitting in a fortress in Naples, had become a living judgment on his father's life's work. Peter understood this with perfect clarity. Retrieving him was not just about punishing a disobedient son, it was about reclaiming control of the narrative, crushing the symbol of the opposition, and demonstrating to the world the inescapable length of his reach. To execute the second, more critical prong of his strategy, Peter knew he needed an operative of exceptional skill and absolute loyalty. A diplomat could deliver threats, but this mission required a man who could navigate the labyrinthine corridors of the Austrian court, apply unbearable psychological pressure, and manipulate his target with a surgeon's precision. He found the perfect instrument in Count Pyotr Andreevich Tolstoy. Tolstoy was a man uniquely suited the task, a member of an ancient noble family. He was no mere product of Peter's new meritocracy. Yet he had embraced the new order with the zeal of a convert, serving Peter loyally for decades in a series of sensitive diplomatic posts, most notably as ambassador to the Ottoman Empire. He was cunning, patient, utterly ruthless, and a master of psychological manipulation. He understood the old world from which Alexei had come, and the new world his father had built. The perfect man to hunt the Tsarevich. Tolstoy, along with Captain Alexander Rumiantz of the Preobrazhensky Guard, a man whose presence signified the military and coercive power of the state, was dispatched from Amsterdam with a single, unambiguous mandate: bring Alexei back to Russia. The Tsar's instructions were a masterwork of calculated ambiguity. Tolstoy was to secure an audience with the emperor and demand Alexei's surrender. But Peter knew the emperor would not simply hand him over, as this would be an admission of his own duplicity. The real mission was to get to Alexei himself. Tolstoy was authorized to promise anything: a full pardon, the Tsar's forgiveness, a life of quiet retirement, the right to live with his mistress. He was to use any means necessary: entreaties, threats, fabricated letters, emotional blackmail, to persuade the terrified and isolated Tsarevich that returning to Russia was his only safe option. The Tsar was unleashing his most formidable political operative, a fox sent to lure the wolf's cub out of a foreign den with the promise of a warm hearth, all while concealing the cage that awaited him. The arrival of Pyotr Tolstoy and Captain Alexander Rumiantz in Vienna in the summer of 1717 marked a decisive escalation in the crisis. This was no ordinary diplomatic mission. Tolstoy was the Tsar's personal agent, a man known for his subtlety and implacable will. Rumiantz, a decorated officer of Peter's elite guards regiment, was the physical embodiment of the Tsar's military power. His presence was not for protocol, it was a silent, unambiguous threat. But to retrieve, they were the instruments of a singular, unbending royal command. Their first objective was to dismantle the wall of diplomatic obstruction erected by the Austrian court. Armed with the Tsar's full authority and incontrovertible evidence, Tolstoy bypassed the lower echelons of the bureaucracy and secured an audience with the key figures of Emperor Charles VI's government, including the Vice-Chancellor, Count Schönborn. The tone of these meetings was entirely different from the earlier inquiries made by the resident, Sky. Tolstoy did not plead or request, he demanded. He presented the Austrian sheltering of the Tsarevich not as a misunderstanding or a humanitarian gesture, but as a hostile act, a violation of the fundamental trust between allied sovereigns. The threats he delivered were stark and delivered with the cold precision of a seasoned diplomat. He articulated the full range of consequences for non-compliance. First, a complete and immediate rupture of diplomatic relations. Second, the cessation of all Russian military cooperation against the Ottoman Empire, a move that would leave Austria's vulnerable eastern flank dangerously exposed. He hinted that the Tsar would consider actively supporting Austria's rivals in the complex politics of the Holy Roman Empire and Poland. Finally, the unspoken but ever-present threat of direct military conflict lingered over the proceedings. Tolstoy made it clear that Craig viewed this matter as a casus belli, a justification for war, and that he was prepared to set Europe ablaze to reclaim his son. Faced with this relentless pressure, the emperor's position became untenable. The strategic calculus had shifted dramatically. Harboring Alexei was no longer a valuable political asset. It had become a catastrophic liability. A war with Russia over a fugitive prince was a strategic insanity that the Habsburg Empire, with its commitments in Italy and its rivalry with France, could not avert. I was a ruler guided by the pragmatic principles of realpolitik, and the reality was that the Tsar's fury was a far greater threat than any potential benefit from holding on to the Tsarevich. A decision was made in the secret councils of the Hofburg. Alexei Petrovich had to be surrendered. However, the emperor could not simply hand over a man to whom he had formally granted protection. Such a blatant betrayal would irrevocably damage his honor and his standing among the other monarchs of Europe. A face-saving mechanism was required. The solution was a masterpiece of diplomatic evasion. The emperor would not extradite the Tsarevich. Instead, he would grant the Tsar's envoys, Tolstoy and Rumiants, unrestricted access to him. He would provide them with an imperial safe-conduct, allowing them to travel to Naples and speak with Alexei directly. The official position was that the Tsarevich, having come of his own free will, must also be allowed to leave of his own free will. The Austrians would simply step aside and allow father and son, through their intermediaries, to resolve their own affairs. This decision effectively abandoned Alexei to his fate. It removed the physical shield of the Habsburg state and left him to face his father's agents, armed only with his own terrified and vacillating will. With the emperor's reluctant blessing and official travel documents in hand, Tolstoy and Rumiants immediately departed for Italy. Their journey south was no longer a covert pursuit but an officially sanctioned mission. They traveled with speed and purpose, the final leg of a hunt that had spanned 1717, and presented their credentials to the Austrian viceroy, who had received explicit instructions from Vienna to offer them his full cooperation. They were escorted to the Castel Sant Elmo, the massive fortress overlooking the bay. The chase was over. The fox had cornered his prey. All that remained was to persuade him to walk willingly into the trap. The confrontation at the Castel Sant Elmo was not a negotiation between equals, it was a psychological siege. Tsarevich Alexei, isolated for months, plagued by anxiety, and now definitively abandoned by his imperial protectors, was a man whose defenses were already critically weakened. Facing him were not soldiers with battering rams, but two masters of corrosive statecraft. Pyotr Tolstoy, the seasoned diplomat, was the voice of the operation, while Captain Rumiants of the Preobrazhensk I Guard was its silent, menacing shadow. Their strategy was a systematic dismantling of Alexei's will, a methodical application of hope and terror in alternating doses until their target was rendered incapable of further resistance. The first phase of the assault was one of carefully constructed clemency. Tolstoy did not begin with accusations or threats. Instead, he presented himself as an emissary of paternal love and forgiveness. He carried with him a letter, written in the Tsar's own hand. This document was the centerpiece of the initial strategy. In it, Peter swore a solemn oath: if Alexei returned to Russia willingly, he would be granted a full and unconditional pardon. He would not be subjected to any form of corporal punishment or even verbal reproach. He would be allowed to retain his mistress Afrosinya, and he would be permitted to live a life of quiet retirement on his country estates, freed from all the burdens of state which he had claimed were so onerous. This promise was a masterstroke of psychological manipulation. It was not a generic offer of amnesty. It was a bespoke solution tailored to address every one of Alexei's stated fears and desires. It offered an end to the conflict, a life of peace, and the legitimate of his relationship with the woman he loved. It was, in effect, the very outcome he had fantasized about. Tolstoy presented this offer not as a concession, but as the heartfelt plea of a father who, despite his anger, still loved his son and wished only for his return. As Tolstoy spoke of forgiveness, Rumiant stood by, a tall, imposing figure in the severe, dark green uniform of Peter's elite regiment. He said little. He did not need to. His very presence was a constant, physical reminder of the alternative to accepting the Tsar's mercy. He was the embodiment of the state's coercive power, the iron fist inside Tolstoy's velvet glove. Predictably, Alexei was suspicious. He had been conditioned by years of his father's threats and violent temper to distrust any promise of clemency. He hesitated, prevaricated, and attempted to negotiate for stronger guarantees. This was the moment Tolstoy had anticipated. With Alexei's refusal, the second phase of the siege began. The tone shifted from conciliation to menace. Tolstoy began to paint a stark, terrifying picture of the alternative to voluntary return. He first attacked Alexei's sense of security, making it clear that the emperor's protection was an illusion. The Austrians, he explained, now saw Alexei as a dangerous liability. They would not risk a war with Russia to protect him. Sooner or later, they would hand him over. By refusing the Tsar's gracious offer, he was merely delaying the inevitable and ensuring that his eventual return would be as a captured traitor, not a forgiven son. Next, Tolstoy threatened Alexei with public and permanent dishonor. He informed the Tsarevich that if he did not comply, the Tsar was prepared to issue a manifesto to be read in every court in Europe, publicly disowning him, stripping him of his succession rights, and declaring him a traitor in league with foreign powers. He would become a stateless pariah, a man without a country, a future, or a name. The most potent threat, however, was directed not at Alexei himself, but at those he had left behind. Tolstoy made it brutally clear that Alexei's continued defiance would be interpreted as evidence of a wider conspiracy, and the full force of the state's investigative apparatus would be unleashed upon his friends and supporters in Russia. He mentioned names like Alexander Kikin, reminding Alexei that these men had families. Their lives, their fortunes, their lives, and their freedom now rested entirely on Alexei's decision. This masterfully shifted the moral burden. His defiance was no longer an act of self-minus preservation. It was a selfish act that would condemn his friends to torture and death. Finally, Tolstoy swore a second, even more solemn oath before a religious icon brought for the occasion. He swore on his own soul and in the name of God that the Tsar's promise of a full pardon was absolute. For Alexei, a man of deep if troubled piety, an oath sworn on a sacred icon was the most binding contract imaginable. It was a piece of spiritual theater designed to overwhelm his last reserves of doubt. The web was now complete. He was trapped between the promise of a perfect life and the certainty of total ruin, not just for himself, but for everyone he cared about. Psychologically exhausted and cornered, the Tsarevich finally broke. He agreed to return to Russia. The capitulation in the Castle St. Elmo was not a single, dramatic moment of surrender, but the final, quiet collapse of a structure that had been systematically undermined for weeks. When Tsarevich Alexei finally gave his assent, it was with the exhausted resignation of a man who had depleted his last reserves of defiance. The decision to return, which in hindsight appears as an act of profound political naivety, was in fact the culmination of a series of interlocking pressures, each one carefully calibrated to exploit his specific psychological vulnerabilities. To trust the assurances of his father, mediated by an operative as notoriously cunning as Pyotr Tolstoy, was not a rational choice, but the only choice left to a mind stripped of all other options. The primary factor compelling his decision was the complete and unambiguous withdrawal of his external support. For nearly a year, Alexei had existed under the aegis of the Holy Roman Emperor. While this protection was isolating and restrictive, it was nonetheless the foundational premise of his entire strategy of survival. The moment the Austrian viceroy and viceroy in Naples facilitated the meeting with Tolstoy and Rumians, that premise was invalidated. He was no longer a guest of the emperor. He was a liability being disposed of. Tolstoy expertly drove this point home, framing the emperor's cooperation not as a neutral act, but as the first step in a process of forcible extradition. Alexei was made to understand that he had no allies left. The fortress walls that had kept his father's agents out were now the very walls that kept him cornered. He had run out of protectors and run out of geography. Upon this foundation of absolute isolation, Tolstoy constructed a brilliant psychological architecture of hope and fear. The promises were not vague. They were specific, detailed, and targeted. The offer of a full pardon appealed to his fear of physical punishment. The pledge that he could retire to his estates and marry his mistress, Afrosinya, was a direct appeal to the life of quiet domesticity he craved. This was not just an offer of survival, it was the offer of his deepest desires, a fantasy life presented as a tangible reality. It allowed him to engage in a powerful form of wishful thinking to convince himself that his father, having gone to such lengths to retrieve him, might genuinely be weary of the conflict and willing to accept a peaceful resolution. For a son who had spent his life yearning for a measure of paternal approval, the idea of forgiveness, however improbable, was an intoxicating lure. The solemnity with which these promises were made was crucial. The oath sworn on an icon was not a mere diplomatic formality. For Alexei, a man of sincere, if conventional piety, this was a sacred and binding act. To believe that a man like Tolstoy would perjure himself before God in such a manner was, for Alexei, a conceptual leap he was unwilling or unable to make. He judged Tolstoy's actions by his own moral and spiritual framework, a fatal miscalculation. He failed to understand that for men like his father and Tolstoy, the interests of the state were the ultimate morality, and any oath was merely a tool to serve that end. The inverse of this constructed hope was a terror that was equally specific and personal. The genius of Tolstoy's strategy lay in the lever of moral blackmail. By explicitly naming Alexei's friends in Russia, Alexander Kikin and others, and linking their fate to his cooperation, Tolstoy transformed Alexei's decision from a matter of self-preservation into one of moral responsibility. To continue his defiance would be to sign their death warrants. He would be responsible for the interrogations, tortures, and executions of the very people who had tried to help him. This was a burden his conscience could not bear. He was being forced to choose between his own precarious freedom and the lives of his friends. For a man who lacked the ruthless calculus of a true political player, this choice was no choice at all. He was compelled to sacrifice himself. Their journey from Naples began in early October 1717. The Austrian authorities, deeply relieved to be rid of their dangerous guest, provided every assistance. The procession that traveled north through Italy was no longer that of a fugitive, but of a royal heir being escorted home. Yet, this veneer of protocol was thin. Alexei was now under the constant watch of Tolstoy and Rumiants. He was their responsibility, their prize. As they traveled through Bologna and across the Alps, back into the Emperor's Austrian lands, Alexei likely clung to the promises made to him. It was a period of transit, a psychological limbo between the terror of the hunt and the uncertainty of the homecoming. He had made a fatal decision based on a desperate trust in assurances that were designed not to be honored, but to be effective. He had chosen to believe in mercy because the alternative, the cold, limitless nature of his father's will, was too terrible to fully comprehend. The long journey from Naples back towards Russia was a carefully managed theatrical production, with Pyotr Tolstoy serving as its director. The pace was deliberate, and at each stage, Alexei was treated with the formal respect due to a Tsarevich. He was allowed his own retinue, and his comfort was seen to. This veneer of civility was a crucial part of the psychological operation. It was designed to lull Alexei into a false sense of security, to reinforce the belief that he was returning as a forgiven son, not a captive. The letters he was encouraged to write to his father during this period were models of contrite submission, likely drafted with Tolstoy's heavy guidance. They were part of the script, confessions of errant pleas for the very mercy that had already been promised. The promises themselves were the core of the deception, a pardon written in an ink that was chemically designed to disappear the moment it was exposed to the air of Russia. The solemn oaths sworn in Naples were tactical instruments. Their purpose fulfilled the moment Alexei agreed to leave the Castel Sant'Elmo. For Peter, the concepts of forgiveness and mercy were subordinate to the absolute imperatives of state security and dynastic stability. Alexei's flight was not a personal failing to be forgiven. It was an act of high treason that had scandalized Europe, threatened his alliances, and provided a focal point for all domestic opposition. The idea that such an act could be pardoned with a quiet retirement to a country estate was a political absurdity. The state, as Peter conceived it, did not forgive such existential threats, it neutralized them. The moment the convoy crossed the Russian border, the atmosphere began to change. The deference shown to the Tsarevich became more formal, the guards more watchful. The fiction of a voluntary return was maintained, but the underlying reality of a state-security operation became increasingly palpable. The final leg of the journey was not to St. Petersburg, the new capital, but to Moscow, the ancient heart of the Tsardom and the center of the traditionalist sentiment with which Alexei was so closely associated. The choice of venue was deliberate and laden with symbolic meaning. It was here, in the spiritual center of the old world he was seen to represent, that he would be publicly and systematically dismantled. The unraveling of the promises began on January 31, 1718, the day Alexei arrived in Moscow. He was not taken to a royal residence to await a private, paternal reconciliation. Instead, he was brought directly to the Kremlin and lodged under heavy guard. The promised meeting with his father was not a family affair but a formal, public tribunal. The Tsar did not greet him as a son but as a head of state confronting a criminal. The reunion took place in the Great Hall of the Kremlin, in the presence of the highest dignitaries of the state and the church, senators, ministers, and bishops. This was not an audience for forgiveness, it was a stage for humiliation. Peter, in a cold, controlled fury, immediately nullified every assurance that Tolstoy had made. He addressed Alexei not with paternal admonition, but with a formal accusation. He recounted the history of his son's disobedience, his indolence, and his association with reactionaries. He detailed the disgrace and danger his flight had brought upon the Russian state. He then addressed the promise of a pardon. He declared that while he had indeed promised to forgive his son, this forgiveness was conditional. It was contingent upon a full and unreserved confession. Alexei was required to reveal the name of every single person who had aided him in his flight or had ever expressed seditious thoughts in his presence. He was to conceal nothing and no one. If he complied fully, the Tsar stated, he would spare his life. If he concealed even the smallest detail, the pardon was void, and he would be executed as a traitor. This was the ultimate betrayal. The unconditional pardon sworn upon a sacred icon was revealed to be a transcational and coercive tool. It had been a lie from the beginning, a key to unlock an Austrian fortress now discarded as useless. Alexei was trapped. He had returned willingly, disarming himself based on a solemn promise, only to find that the terms had been rewritten. He was now being commanded to become the chief witness in a state-sponsored purge, to betray everyone who had ever trusted him or shown him sympathy. The choice he was given was no choice at all: become an informer for the secret chancellery or face certain death. The journey home had not led to a quiet country estate, but to the antechamber of an interrogation room. The pardon had vanished, leaving only the cold, hard calculus of the Petrine state. Faced with the complete evaporation of the promised pardon and the stark choice between collaboration and execution, the Tsarevich Alexei Petrovich offered no further resistance. His psychological defenses had been breached and his will to defy his father was extinguished. He was now a component in a state-managed process, and his only available strategy was one of minimal compliance in the desperate hope of self-preservation. On February 3, 1718, just days after his arrival, he submitted his first written confession. It was a document crafted to satisfy the immediate demands of the Tsar without, he hoped, condemning his entire circle of associates. He admitted his flight had been a grave error, prompted by fear. He named the individuals who had directly facilitated his journey: Alexander Kikin, his equerry, and a few others. He attempted to portray the affair as a personal failing, a panic-driven mistake, rather than an organized political conspiracy. This partial and self-serving confession was precisely what Peter had expected. It was also entirely insufficient. The Tsar was not interested in the logistics of the escape. He was hunting for the root of the ideological disease he believed his son embodied. This initial confession, however, served a vital purpose. It was an admission of guilt, a legal foundation upon which the subsequent proceedings could be built. With this document in hand, Peter moved to the next phase of his strategy: the public and irrevocable destruction of Alexei's status as heir. The chosen venue for this act of political theater was the Cathedral of the Assumption within the Moscow Kremlin. This was no arbitrary choice. The cathedral was the historical and spiritual heart of the Russian monarchy. It was where the Tsar's work round, a sacred space that symbolized the divine covenant between the ruler and God. To use this stage for a ceremony of disinheritance was a calculated act of symbolic violence, a demonstration that the Tsar's will could unmake what God and tradition had made. On a cold Sunday morning, the elite of the Russian Empire were once again assembled. The members of the governing Senate, the highest ranking military officers, and the senior hierarchs of the Orthodox Church stood as witnesses. Tsar Peter presided, his demeanor impassive and severe, the embodiment of the state as an impersonal force. Alexei was brought before this assembly, not as a Tsarevich, but as a penitent criminal. He was made to listen as a formal manifesto, drafted by the Tsar, was read aloud. It recounted his unworthy life, his disobedience, and his treasonous flight, concluding that he was unfit to inherit the throne, as he would surely squander the empire and undo his father's great works. Then came the central act of the ritual. A formal oath of renunciation was placed before Alexei. He was compelled to read its text aloud, his voice echoing in the cavernous, icon-line space of the cathedral. The oath was a document of complete and total self-abnegation. In it, he acknowledged his sins and his unworthiness. He formally and forever renounced his right to the Russian throne. Crucially, the oath was written to be dynastic and absolute. He renounced the succession not only for himself but also for his own male heir, the infant Peter Alexeyevich, who was now quietly living under the Tsar's control. This was a critical clause, designed to extinguish his entire lineage as a potential source of future opposition. The final, and perhaps most humiliating, part of the oath was the pledge of allegiance to the new order. Alexei was forced to recognize his younger half-brother, the 2-year-old Peter Petrovich, the son of the Tsar and the former peasant girl Catherine, as the one and only true heir to the throne. He had to swear to accept this new Tsarevich as his future sovereign and to never, under any circumstances, seek the crown for himself or his descendants. He was required to sign it and kiss the cross and the Gospels, binding his soul to its terms before God. The senior clergy, including the locum tenens of the patriarchal throne, then formally blessed the act, giving the Church's sanction to the Tsar's will. The ceremony was a political and legal masterstroke. It stripped Alexei of all his titles and claims. It established a new, unquestionable line of succession. It legitimized the Tsar's actions in the eyes of the state and the Church, framing them not as a personal vendetta but as a necessary act of national preservation. For Alexei, it was the moment of his complete civil death. He had entered the cathedral as the Tsarevich. He left it as Alexei Petrovich, a private individual, a disinherited son, officially a prisoner of the state. Immediately following the ceremony, his status was formalized. He was taken from the Kremlin and placed under formal arrest. His household was dissolved, and he was handed over to the officers of the secret chancellery, the Tsar's feared political police. The public humiliation was complete. The far more private and brutal process of the investigation was about to begin. With the Tsarevich stripped of his titles and placed under formal arrest, the public phase of the process concluded. The silent, methodical work of the investigation now began in earnest. This task fell to an institution created by Peter for precisely such purposes, the Secret Chancellery of Investigation, or Preobrazhensky Prikaz. This was not a conventional judicial body bound by established legal codes. It was the nerve center of the Russian political police, an instrument of the Tsar's personal will, operating with near-limitless authority to investigate and prosecute crimes against the state. Its mandate was to uncover and eradicate sedition in all its forms, and its methods were efficient, secretive, and brutal. The formal establishment of the state inquiry into the conspiracy of the Tsarevich was, in effect, the full mobilization of this apparatus. At its head was Pyotr Tolstoy, the very man who had engineered Alexei's return. This appointment was no coincidence. It ensured that the man who held the key to all the promises made in Naples was now in the position of chief inquisitor. He was joined by other trusted lieutenants of the Tsar, forming a special commission of inquiry. Their objective was not merely to confirm the details of Alexei's flight. Peter was convinced that the flight was not an act of personal desperation but the symptom of a much deeper and more widespread conspiracy, a Ziegler among the old elites to undermine his reforms and, upon his death, to seize power through his son. The investigation was therefore designed as a political purge, an opportunity to identify, expose, and eliminate this entire network of opposition. The machine began its work with the raw material provided by Alexei's initial, coerced confession, the names of those who had directly abetted his escape. The first wave of arrests was swift and targeted. Alexander Kikin, the former favorite of Peter and the alleged mastermind of the flight, was apprehended. Alexei's confessor, Yakovignet Yev, was taken into custody. Members of Alexei's small household, like his attendant Ivan Afanasyev, were arrested. The net also swept up figures from the old nobility who were known to be close to the Tsarevich, such as the Dulg or Yokai of and Golitsyn families. Each arrest was a single thread, and the purpose of the interrogations was to pull on that thread until it led to another and another, widening the web with each new name extracted. The interrogations took place in the dungeons of the Preobrazhensky Palace in Moscow and, later, in the casemates of the Peter and Paul Fortress in St. Petersburg. The proceedings were conducted with a chilling bureaucratic formality. Detailed records, or protocol Y, were kept of every session, every question, every denial, and every eventual confession was transcribed by a clerk. A paper trail that gave the proceedings the appearance of a legitimate judicial inquiry. Central to this process was the legally sanctioned use of judicial torture. In the Russian legal system of the time, this was known as due process pристрастием, or interrogation with rigor. It was not seen as a punishment, but as a methodological tool for extracting the truth. The logic, however perverse, was that a person under extreme duress would be unable to maintain a lie, and that pain was the most effective solvent for falsehood. A confession obtained without the application of duress was considered less reliable than one extracted under it. The primary instrument was the K-out, a heavy, multi-thumb leather whip capable of flaying skin and breaking bone. The number of strokes was carefully recorded in the official transcripts. If the K-out failed to produce the desired results, other methods could be employed. The process was not arbitrary violence. It was a calibrated application of pain, a scientific procedure within the dark science of the Petrine state. The great investigation machine was now fully operational, its gears grinding. The first subjects, Alexei's circle of friends and associates, were being fed into its mechanism, and the machine was designed to process them until it had produced the one commodity the Tsar demanded above all others, a grand, unified narrative of treason. The first to be subjected to the full, systematic rigor of the secret chancellery was Alexander Kikin. As the alleged primary architect of the flight, his testimony was considered foundational to the entire investigation. Kikin was a man of the court, intelligent and hardened by the political intrigues of the Petrine era. In his initial interrogations, he maintained a defiant silence or offered only minimal, evasive answers, admitting already confessed. However, was anticipated by his interrogators. It was merely the first stage of a well-rehearsed procedure. The order was given for due process pристрастием. The process was documented with bureaucratic precision. Kikin was subjected to a specified number of strokes with the K-out. The official record notes his initial stoicism, but as the physical trauma accumulated, his resolve began to fracture. The interrogations were not single sessions but a sustained campaign of pain, deprivation, and psychological pressure conducted over several days. After one particularly severe application, his resistance collapsed completely. The testimony that poured out of him was exactly what the investigators were seeking. He not only confirmed his central role in planning and financing the escape to Vienna, but began to elaborate on the political context. He recounted conversations held in Alexei's private circle, discussions about the unpopularity of the Tsar's reforms, the heavy burden of taxation in war, and the hope for a different future under a different ruler. He testified that they had spoken of what would happen upon the Tsar's death, and that Alexei had allegedly promised to abandon St. Petersburg, disband the navy, and reduce the army. Kuchyin's confession provided the investigators with their first major breakthrough. It transformed the narrative from one of a son fleeing a domineering father into one of a seditious political faction with a clear, counter-revolutionary agenda. His testimony also provided a fresh list of names, individuals who had been present during these conversations or had expressed similar sentiments. The investigation machine now had new fuel. The focus then shifted to Alexei's spiritual circle, particularly his confessor, Ignat Yev. As the keeper of the Tsarevich conscience, he was believed to hold the key to his innermost thoughts and ideological motivations. Ignat Yev, like Kikin, initially refused to cooperate, perhaps citing the sanctity of the confessional seal. Such religious scruples, however, held no currency in the secret chancellery. He was subjected to the same methodical application of pain. Corroborated Kuchyin's from a different angle. He spoke of Alexei's deep and abiding piety, his genuine horror at his father's ecclesiastical reforms, and his belief that the Petrine state was a profane deviation from Russia's sacred path. He provided the ideological motive that complemented the political grievances described by Kikin. With these two foundational testimonies secured, the net widened dramatically. Members of the great noble families who had been close to Alexei, such as Prince Vasily Vladimirovich Dulg or Yokov, were arrested and interrogated. The methodology became self-perpetuating and brutally efficient. A new suspect would be brought in unconfronted with the signed, detailed confessions of Kikin or Ignat Yev. They were informed that their accomplices had already revealed everything. Their denials were thus presented not as protestations of innocence, but as proof of their obstinacy, which in turn justified the immediate application of torture. This technique created a cascade of coerced denunciations. Prisoners broken by pain and desperate to make it stop would agree to the narrative presented to them by the interrogators. They would confirm their presence at a certain gathering, affirm that a seditious statement had been made, and, in the process, implicate others who were present. A casual complaint about high taxes, uttered months or years earlier in private conversation with the Tsarevich, was now transformed, under duress, into an act of treasonous conspiracy. The interrogators were not discovering a pre-existing plot. They were actively constructing one, using the agony of Alexei's friends as their raw material. Each new testimony was compared and collated with the others, inconsistencies were noted, and prisoners were interrogated until a single, coherent, and damning narrative emerged. The circle of friends was being systematically turned into a circle of accusers, and their collective, pain-induced testimony was forming a wall of evidence around the man at the center of it all. The interrogations conducted by the secret chancellery were not a search for truth in the modern sense. They were a process of narrative construction. The objective was not to discover what had happened, but to produce a legally unassailable account that confirmed the Tsar's deepest suspicions. The primary tools for this construction were the carefully documented testimonies, each one extracted through a methodical application of physical and psychological duress. The chancellery functioned as a grim factory, taking in the raw material of terrified individuals and processing them into a coherent, unified, and damning story of treason. The core of the methodology was the leading question. Interrogators did not ask suspects, "What did you speak of with the Tsarevich?" Instead, they presented a premise and demanded confirmation. "Is it not true that on such such a date, you heard the Tsarevich express a wish for his father's death, so that the old ways might be restored?" A denial was met with the application of the canon out. The pain would be increased incrementally until the prisoner, often in a state of delirium and shock, finally uttered the desired affirmation. This yes, however faint or coerced, was then duly recorded by the clerk as a voluntary confession of fact. The context of its extraction, the preceding hours of agony, was omitted from the formal record. This process was repeated with dozens of individuals. Each confession, once signed, became a fixed point of evidence. It was then used as leverage against the next prisoner. A new suspect would be confronted not with vague accusations, but with a stack of signed testimonies from his peers. Your friend Prince do LG or UKOV has already confessed that you were present when this was discussed. By denying it, you are not only lying but also proving your obstinacy, which necessitates further rigor. This created an inescapable feedback loop. To maintain one's innocence was to invite ever-minus increasing levels of pain, while the path of least resistance, and the only way to stop the torture, was to agree with the existing narrative and, in the process, to embellish it with further details or implicate others to prove one's newfound cooperation. Through this method, the investigators meticulously wove together disparate threads of discontent into the tapestry: a nobleman's private complaint about the cost of building the new fleet, a priest's lament for the decline of the patriarchate, a merchant's grumbling about taxes, all were array-minus contextualized. They were no longer isolated grievances but were presented as interconnected data points in a coordinated plot to overthrow the state. The investigators were particularly focused on establishing two key elements. The first was the intent to reverse Peter's reforms. Confessions were shaped to show that Alexei had made specific promises to his inner circle. He would abandon St. Petersburg, scuttle the navy, move the capital back to Moscow, and release the nobility from their obligations of state service. The second and far more critical element was the theme of regicide. Interrogators relentlessly pursued any hint that the Tsarevich and his circle had not merely hoped for the Tsar's death by natural causes but had actively wished for it. Vague, resentful statements were sharpened into concrete expressions of treasonous intent. A prisoner might be asked if he had heard Alexei say, "I wish my father were with God," under duress. This could be amplified and recorded as, "The Tsarevich confessed his desire for the Tsar's death." The investigation also sought to link Alexei's flight to a plan to return with for unmilitary aid. The fact that he had sought refuge with the Emperor Charles VI was presented as proof that he intended to return at the head of an Austrian army to claim the throne by force. There was no evidence for this, but through the mechanics of the interrogation process, testimony was generated to support it. The fear was as potent a tool as the pain. The prisoners understood that their ordeal would only end when they had provided a confession that satisfied their inquisitors. They also knew that their families and fortunes were at stake. Cooperation, even if it meant fabricating evidence against themselves and their friends, seemed to offer the only slim chance of a merciful sentence. The result of this process, conducted over several months, was a mountain of internally consistent, cross-corroborated, and legally documented testimony. It told a clear and unambiguous story. The Tsarevich Alexei Petrovich was the leader of a dangerous cabal of reactionaries who had plotted to undo the Russian Revolution and who had eagerly awaited, and perhaps even conspired to hasten, the death of the reigning Tsar. This narrative, built entirely on a foundation of pain and fear, was now complete. It was a weapon, ready to be used against its final target. While the interrogations of Kik and other political associates had successfully constructed the framework of a widespread conspiracy, the Tsar's investigators required the final, critical pillars of testimony to complete the edifice. They needed to penetrate the Tsarevich's innermost circle, to transform his private thoughts and spiritual beliefs into prosecutable acts of treason. This required breaking the two individuals who had been closest to him during his flight and exile, his mistress, Afrosinya Fedorova, and his personal confessor, Yakov Ignat Yev. Their testimonies, one concerning the intimate and the other the sacred, were considered essential to sealing Alexei's fate. Afrosinya Fedorova was a Finnish serf, a woman of no social standing, whose life was completely entwined with Alexei's. She had accompanied him on his desperate journey across Europe, lived with him in the fortresses of Orenburg and Naples, and had borne him a child. She was a witness to his most unguarded moments, his drunken laments, his expressions of fear and resentment, and his private conversations about the future. She was immediately separated from Alexei and their child and placed in custody. As an noble and a woman, she was in a position of absolute powerlessness, entirely at the mercy of the state and its interrogators. Her value to the investigation was immense. She could provide a first-hand account of Alexei's state of mind, his true feelings about his father, and any treasonous plans, he might have discussed in what he believed to be the safety of his private chambers. The methods used to secure her cooperation are not detailed with the same clinical precision as those used on the male political prisoners, but the psychological pressure would have been overwhelming. The fate of her infant son, who was now a ward of the state, would have been a potent unspoken lever. Her own life hung by a thread. Under these conditions of extreme duress, she provided a devastatingly detailed account. Her testimony painted a portrait of a weak, bitter, and resentful man who was actively hoping for his father's death. She recounted how, in Naples, Alexei had written letters to senators on doshabos in Russia, complaining of his father's tyranny and seemingly testing the waters for support. She testified that he frequently cursed the Tsar, as well as his powerful favorite, Alexander Menshikov. Most damningly, she spoke of his reactions to news from Russia. When he heard reports of a riot in the army or of the Tsar's ill health, his mood would improve. Conversely, when he learned of a Russian military victory, he would become sullen and angry. She stated that Alexei had openly expressed his wish for his father to die, believing it was the only event that could deliver him. Afrosinya's testimony was a betrayal born of terror, but for the investigators, it was pure gold. It provided the emotional and personal evidence of treasonous intent, straight from the Tsarevich's own bedchamber. If Afrosinya's testimony condemned the son, that of Yakov Ignatyev was intended to condemn the would-be sovereign. As Alexei's spiritual father, Ignatyev had been the custodian of his conscience. The relationship between a believer and his confessor was, in the Orthodox tradition, a sacred and inviolable bond. The secret chancellery had no respect for such sanctity ties. Ignatyev was arrested and subjected to the same interrogation with rigor as the other political prisoners. The goal was to force him to divulge the contents of Alexei's confessions, to turn the sacrament into an instrument of the state. Under the methodical application of pain, Ignatyev broke. His testimony provided the ideal foundation for the entire conspiracy narrative. He confirmed that Alexei held a deep-seated theological opposition to his father's entire reform project. According to Ignatyev's coerced confession, the Tsarevich viewed his father not just as a political opponent but as a heretic, a destroyer of the Holy Orthodox faith. He testified that Alexei had spoken of the Tsar as the Antichrist, a figure who had defiled Russia with foreign customs, shaved the God-given beards of pious men, and subordinated the church to the profane authority of the state. Ignatyev recounted conversations in which Alexei had promised that, upon his accession to the throne, he would lead a great restoration. He would move the capital back to the sacred city of Moscow, cast out the foreigners who had infested the court, and return the church to its rightful, preeminent place. Together, these two testimonies formed a perfect, closed loop of incrimination. Afrosinya provided the evidence of personal malice and the desire for his father's death. Ignatyev provided the evidence of a grand, ideological motive for treason, a holy crusade to overthrow a heretical regime. One spoke to his character, the other to his political program. The state now possessed sworn statements from his lover and his priest, both testifying that the Tsarevich was a traitor in his heart and in his soul. With this evidence secured, there was no longer any need to rely on the testimony of political rivals or disgruntled courtiers. The case against Alexei Petrovich was now complete, built on the coerced words of those who had known him most intimately. With the architecture of the conspiracy now fully documented through a mountain of mutually reinforcing, coerced testimony, the final act of the legal process could commence. The investigation, for all its brutality, had served its primary purpose. It had generated a seemingly unassailable body of evidence. However, for Tsar Peter, a private conviction of his son's guilt was not sufficient. As an autocrat who was also a student of Western European statecraft, he understood the immense power of legal formalism. A simple, quiet execution in a dungeon cell was the method of a medieval despot. Peter sought to legitimize his actions through the public and recorded verdict of a state tribunal. He did not require a trial to determine guilt. That was already a foregone conclusion. But to pronounce it formally, thus transforming an act of filicide into a lawful and necessary act of state preservation. The proceedings began in mid-June 1718. The capital had been moved back to St. Petersburg, and the venue for the trial was the Petropol fortress, the very prison where many of the accused were being held and interrogated. The fortress itself was a symbol of the new Petrine order, a modern, bastion-ed citadel designed according to the latest principles of European military engineering. It ensured absolute security and reinforced the message that this was a matter of military and state security, not common criminal law. The judicial body convened for this purpose was designated the Supreme Court. It was not composed of independent jurists or legal scholars. Its 120-7 members were the absolute elite of the Petrine state, a hand-picked assembly of men whose loyalty to the Tsar was unquestionable and whose careers were a direct result of his patronage. The court was comprised of all the members of the governing senate, the presidents of the administrative colleges, the highest ranking generals of the army, and the admirals of the fleet. Figures like Prince Alexander Menshikov and Pyotr Tolstoy sat as judges. This was not a jury of Alexei's peers. It was an assembly of his father's closest allies and instruments. Their function was not to deliberate on the evidence, but to ratify a verdict that had already been determined by their sovereign. The case against Alexei was presented not by a prosecutor in a traditional adversarial system, but through a systematic reading of the collected evidence. The Commission of Inquiry, led by Tolstoy, had compiled a vast confessions of every implicated individual. Over the course of several days, these documents were read aloud to the assembled court. The testimonies of Alexander Kikin, Yakov Ignat Yev, Afrosinya Fedorova, and dozens of others were entered into the official record. The narrative they presented was overwhelming in its consistency and detail. The court heard of Alexei's plans to abandon the fleet, of his treasonous correspondence from Naples, of his hope for his father's death, and of his theological opposition to the new order. The sheer volume of the evidence, presented without any context of how it had been obtained, created an irrefutable picture of guilt. Alexei himself was brought before the court on several occasions. He was no longer a defendant arguing his case, but an object of the proceedings. He was confronted with the signed confessions of his closest friends, his confessor, and his lover. He was made to listen as their words, extracted under torture, were used to condemn him. His state by this point was one of complete physical and psychological exhaustion. His own earlier confessions, made under the threat of execution, were also read into the record. When questioned by the court, his responses were minimal and often incoherent. He confirmed certain details and denied others, but without conviction or force. He was a broken man, a passive participant in his own judicial destruction. After the presentation of the evidence, the court moved to deliberation. This was a mere formality. The judges were not being asked to weigh innocence against guilt. They were being asked to affirm the prosecutorial narrative and to determine the appropriate punishment for the crime of high treason, as defined by the Tsar himself. On June 24, 1718, the Supreme Court delivered its unanimous verdict. The Tsarevich Alexei Petrovich was found guilty of capital crimes against the state. The judgment declared that he had conceived a rebellion against his sovereign and father and had sought to seize the throne even during the lifetime of his father, with the help of the common people and by destroying the fatherland with the enemy's army. The sentence, as prescribed by both military and civil law for such a crime, was death. The legal proceedings, designed from their inception for this single outcome, had reached their inevitable conclusion. The state had formally and lawfully condemned its own heir. The delivery of the death sentence on June 24, 1718, was a legal formality, the public capstone on a structure of guilt that had been meticulously built over the preceding months. For the Tsarevich Alexei, however, it did not signify the end of his ordeal. The legal conclusion of the trial did not mark the end of the investigation. Returned to his cold, damp cell within the Trubektor bastion of the Petropol fortress, he found himself still in the grip of the machine that had condemned him. The primary objective of the state now shifted. With his guilt legally established and his execution secured, the purpose of the ongoing interrogations was no longer to justify the sentence, but to extract every last piece of information to map the full, hidden geography of the conspiracy that the Tsar was convinced still lurked in the shadows. Peter the Great was a man obsessed with completeness. He could not abide loose threads. He believed that Alexei, even in his broken state, was still protecting others, that the full truth of his intentions and the full list of his accomplices had not yet been revealed. The confession extracted so far was, in the Tsar's view, substantial but incomplete. He needed to know with absolute certainty the answer to the most fundamental question: had his son actively plotted to overthrow and kill him, or had he merely been a passive vessel for the treasonous hopes of others? For this, the standard procedures of the secret chancellery were still deemed necessary. A man already under a sentence of death was not exempt from further interrogation with rigor. The historical record, based on the chancellery's own meticulous logs, indicates that on the very day the death sentence was pronounced, Alexei was once again subjected to interrogation. This session was of a different character from the earlier ones. It was not about his flight or his associates, but about his innermost thoughts. The Tsar himself was reported to be present, along with the inner circle of the investigative commission, Tolstoy, Menshikov, and others. They confronted the condemned man with the ultimate questions. Did you wish for my death? When you heard rumors of rebellion in the army, did you hope for its success? Did you intend to lead a foreign army against your own father and country? Alexei, physically and mentally shattered, gave weak, contradictory answers. He was a man beyond the point of coherent resistance, his reality fractured by months of fear and physical abuse. His denials were not seen as protestations of innocence, but as the final remnants of defiance. The investigators, following the cold logic of their methodology, concluded that only the application of extreme duress could break through this final layer of concealment and expose the absolute truth. The order was given to apply the KNO. The procedure was administered with the same bureaucratic detachment that had characterized the entire investigation. The logs record that Alexei Petrovich, the condemned heir to the Russian Empire, received 15 strokes from the KNO on the afternoon of June 24th. This was inflicted upon a body already severely weakened by previous sessions and the harsh conditions of his imprisonment. The physiological effect was catastrophic. Under this final application of pain, his last defenses crumbled entirely. He confessed to everything. He admitted that he had wished for his father's death. He admitted that he would have supported a rebellion to gain the throne. He gave his inquisitors the total confession they had been relentlessly pursuing, a final, abject validation of the entire state-constructed narrative. Over the next 30-6 hours, Alexei's condition deteriorated rapidly. He was in a state of collapse, suffering from the cumulative trauma of his ordeal. On the morning of June 26, 1718, the Tsar and his senior ministers visited the Tsarevich in his cell one last time. This was not a visit of paternal reconciliation. It was the final act of the investigation, a last opportunity to extract any lingering details before the subject expired. Begged his father for forgiveness one last time. Peter, having already secured the full confession he required, reportedly granted a spiritual pardon, absolving him as a Christian father even as the state he embodied had condemned him. Later that evening, at approximately 6 o'clock, the official announcement was made. The Tsarevich Alexei Petrovich was dead. The official cause of death, as promulgated by the state, was apoplexy. The narrative presented for public and international consumption was that the Tsarevich, already in a fragile state of health, had been so overcome with shame and terror upon hearing the pronouncement of his death sentence that his body had suffered a catastrophic, fatal seizure. This explanation was medically plausible, legally convenient, and politically essential. It severed the direct causal link between the actions of the state's interrogators and the death of the heir, allowing the official record to maintain that Alexei had succumbed to natural causes, albeit under extreme emotional duress, before the lawful sentence of execution could be carried out. It was a neat, bureaucratic solution to a profoundly messy and brutal reality. A forensic analysis of the available records, however, points to a conclusion that is far more direct. The primary instrument of the interrogation with rigor was a specific type of heavy whip, known in English historiography as the KNO. This was not a simple lash but a purpose minus built to love judicial torture, designed to inflict maximum pain and tissue damage without necessarily causing immediate death. Its construction typically involved multiple leather thongs, often unhardenable leather thongs, often hardened or weighted, attached to a handle. Its application was a grim sight. A skilled operator could use the percussive force of the weapon to cause deep tissue contusions, severe internal bleeding, and a state of profound physiological shock, all while minimizing external lacerations if required. The cumulative effect of repeated applications was a systemic trauma from which recovery was often impossible. The official records of the secret chancellery, the state's own documents, provide a clinical timeline of the trauma inflicted upon Alexei. On June 19th, 5 days before the final verdict, he was subjected to 20-5 strokes. This was an extremely severe application, sufficient to incapacitate a healthy man. On June 24th, the very day the death sentence was pronounced, he received a further 15 strokes. This final session was administered to a body already ravaged by the previous ordeal and weakened by months of imprisonment in psychological distress. The two sessions, separated by only 5 days, represent a massive and almost certainly lethal dose of physical trauma. The physiological consequences would have included extensive internal hemorrhaging, the onset of kidney failure, and a complete collapse of the circulatory system, a condition modern medicine would identify as hemorrhagic and traumatic shock. The apoplexy recorded in the official report was, in all likelihood, a symptom of this systemic breakdown, perhaps a cerebral hemorrhage brought on by the massive fluctuations in blood pressure and the extreme stress of organ failure. The cause of death was not the shock of the sentence. It was the methodical, calibrated application of the KNL. The most debated and historically significant question surrounding these final days is the direct involvement of the Tsar himself. The official Russian records are, predictably, silent on the matter. They portray Peter as a distant, grieving sovereign, upholding the law with a heavy heart. However, a significant body of circumstantial evidence and external accounts suggests a far more direct and active role. 4 undiplomats stationed in street, whose dispatches were not subject to state censorship, reported rumors that the Tsar was not only present during the torture sessions, but may have participated himself. While often dismissed by Soviet-era historians as anti-Russian propaganda, these accounts are consistent with everything known about Peter's character. He was a man of visceral hands-on temperament. He did not merely command that ships be built, he worked in the shipyards as a carpenter. He did not just direct his armies from a distant tent. He was present on the battlefield. His involvement in the interrogation of his son was driven by the same obsessive need for control and direct knowledge. He was not a man to delegate the final, critical task of extracting the ultimate truth from his own heir, standing in the dank interrogation chamber of the fortress he had built, observing the methodical destruction of his son, is one that aligns perfectly with his known personality. Whether he personally wielded the instrument is unknowable and ultimately secondary. His presence as the ultimate authority, the approving sovereign, transformed the act from a routine procedure of the secret police into a personal, ritualistic act of filicide, sanctioned and overseen by the father himself. The son was being unmade, piece by piece, in the father's presence, for the sake of the father's state. The death of the Tsarevich did not conclude the affair, it merely removed its central figure. The state machine, having rendered its judgment and overseen its execution, now turned to the final, the administrative tasks of closing the case and managing the narrative. A state funeral was ordered. Alexei Petrovich was interred in the Peter and Paul Cathedral, the new mausoleum of the Romanov dynasty, within the very fortress where he had died. In a final, chilling act of symbolic control, he was laid to rest beside his wife, Princess Charlotte, the foreign, Western bride his father had forced upon him. The ceremony was a public spectacle of imperial grief, a performance designed to project an image of a stern but sorrowful father, forced by the inexorable laws of the state to sacrifice his own son. With the narrative managed, the purge was completed. The other key figures implicated in the conspiracy faced their own sentences. Alexander Kikin, judged to be the chief instigator, was subjected to the public and agonizing execution of being broken on the wheel. Others were beheaded, their heads displayed on spikes as a warning. Many more, including members of the Dulg or Yokov family and Alexei's confessor, were exiled to Siberia or stripped of their lands and titles. Real or imagined, that had coalesced around the figure of the Tsarevich was systematically dismantled, its leaders executed, and its sympathizers scattered. The Tsar's victory was absolute. He had eliminated the symbol of the old world and secured the succession for his chosen heir, the infant Peter Petrovich, the son who embodied the new Russia. But history is governed by an irony more profound than the plans of any autocrat. In April 1719, less than a year after Alexei's death, the young Tsarevich Peter Petrovich, the child for whom the entire brutal affair had been orchestrated, fell ill with smallpox and died. He was just 3.5 years old. This single random act of nature instantly nullified the entire political and dynastic calculus of the past 2 years. The Tsar was once again without a clear, chosen male heir. The legal successor, by the ancient laws of primogeniture that Peter had so violently sought to circumvent, was now the infant son of the executed traitor, Peter Alexeyevich, Alexei's child by Princess Charlotte. The very lineage he had attempted to extinguish was now, by tradition, the rightful heir to his throne. This dynastic crisis, born from the ashes of his personal tragedy, forced Peter to his final and most radical legal innovation. On February 5, 1722, he issued an imperial decree on succession. This single document shattered 1,000 years of Russian tradition. It abolished the principle of hereditary succession through the male line. The new law gave the reigning monarch the absolute and sole power to appoint their own successor, choosing anyone they deemed worthy, whether male or female. The law was the ultimate expression of the Petrine worldview. The state, embodied in the will of the autocrat, was supreme. The welfare and continuity of the empire, as judged by its ruler, superseded any and all claims of blood, birthright, or sacred tradition. The law was not written in ink, it was written in the blood of his son, the final, posthumous product of the affair. It was intended to secure the future of his reforms forever. Instead, it inaugurated a century of instability, assassination, and palace coups, as the throne no longer had a fixed and predictable line of succession, but became the ultimate prize in a perpetual contest for the favor of the dying monarch. And so the state had consumed the sun. The vast impersonal machine of the empire, set in motion by the will of one man, had ground his heir into dust to preserve itself. Yet the story leaves us in the silence of the Petrine fortress, contemplating the nature of the man who ordered it. Was this the act of a monster, a father driven to madness by paranoia and rage, or was it the cold, rational calculation of a visionary, a patriot who deemed the sacrifice of his own blood a necessary price for dragging a medieval nation into the modern world? Peter the Great forged an empire, but the heat of that forge was fueled by a terrible, personal crucible, the ambition that built street. Petersburg and defeated the armies of Sweden was the same ambition that could not tolerate a dissenting son. Fearful humanity of its own child. The fortress still stands, a monument to a father's triumph. But in its cold, silent chambers, one can still feel the echo of the son's tragedy. The official cause of death was apoplexy. The true cause was the state itself. The record is now closed.